Avoidants aren't broken by being left, they're broken by being replaced by peace. Avoidants are not unfamiliar with loss. In fact, loss is one of the few emotional terrains where they feel competent. From an early point, they learned how to brace for absence, how to anticipate withdrawal, how to emotionally preempt rejection by staying one step ahead of it. Distance is not a shock to their system, it's a skill set. Abandonment doesn't destabilize them because it fits neatly into the internal narrative they've been rehearsing for years. People get close, things get intense, and eventually someone leaves. That expectation isn't painful to them. It's regulating. It gives them a sense of predictability in relationships that otherwise feel emotionally unsafe. This is why most forms of rejection fail to land. When you leave angrily, with accusations and emotional intensity spilling over, it doesn't wound them. It reassures them. Your distress becomes evidence that closeness was dangerous, that intimacy inevitably leads to emotional overwhelm, that they were right to keep a protective distance all along. Your pain doesn't register as loss to them, it registers as confirmation. It tells their nervous system, see, this is why I don't stay. When rejection is dramatic, emotionally flooded, or charged with protest, the avoidant doesn't experience it as being left. They experience it as escaping. There's a subtle but critical distinction there. Being left would them to feel chosen and then unchosen. But most avoidants never fully let themselves feel chosen in the first place. They keep one foot out the door emotionally, even when they appear present. So when you exit loudly, it doesn't pierce attachment, it reinforces defense. They don't sit in grief replaying memories the way anxious partners do. Instead, they feel a wave of relief move through their system. Relief that the tension is over. Relief that the emotional demands have stopped. Relief that they no longer have to navigate someone else's needs, expectations, or vulnerability. That relief can be mistaken for indifference, but it's more accurate to call it regulation. Their nervous system is returning to a familiar baseline, autonomy without accountability. This is why most rejection actually strengthens avoidant defenses instead of breaking them. It validates the story they already tell themselves, that closeness is unstable, that emotions escalate, that attachment leads to pressure. Your emotional reaction becomes the final exhibit in a case they've been building long before you arrived. And once that story is reinforced, they don't feel loss. They feel justified. If your absence feels loud, it won't reach them. Avoidants are remarkably resistant to rejection that announces itself. They can tolerate and often dismiss anything that still orbits around them emotionally. Ultimatums don't unsettle them, they trigger defiance or withdrawal. Emotional appeals don't soften them, they register as pressure. Performative self-respect, where boundaries are stated loudly but collapse internally, doesn't command respect. It signals unresolved attachment. Even sudden coldness meant to provoke a reaction doesn't land the way people expect. To an avoidant, that kind of withdrawal feels strategic, reactive, and ultimately reversible. Why? Because all of these behaviors, despite appearing strong or decisive on the surface, still position the avoidant as the emotional center of gravity. They communicate, my behavior is about you, my distance is for you, my pain is because of you. And as long as that dynamic remains intact, the avoidant doesn't experience rejection. They experience control. Avoidants are attuned to emotional leverage. They can sense when absence is being used as a signal rather than a state, when your withdrawal is designed to be noticed, felt, or responded to. It keeps them in the position of evaluator. Will I respond? Will I re-engage? Will I stay distant? That evaluative role is where avoidance feels safest. It restores their sense of power over proximity. This is why loud absence fails. Silence that waits to be broken still speaks. Distance that hopes to be chased still connects. Even firm boundaries can be ignored if they are emotionally charged with expectation. As long as your internal state is tracking whether they notice, miss, or react, the avoidant remains psychologically centered, and when they are centered, they do not feel rejected. They feel dominant. Rejection to an avoidant only registers when it removes their position in the emotional hierarchy, when they are no longer the reference point around which your nervous system organizes itself. As long as they remain the axis, whether through conflict, longing, anger, or longing disguised as strength, They are not experiencing loss. They are experiencing relevance. This is where most people misunderstand. Avoidance. They assume pain comes from deprivation of contact, but avoidants are not regulated by contact. They are regulated by autonomy. As long as they sense that they still matter emotionally, positively or negatively, they retain that autonomy. What they fear is not being left. What they fear is becoming unnecessary. That's why rejection, that is designed to be felt, rarely reaches them. It's too expressive, too charged, too relational. It keeps the attachment loop alive. And avoidants don't break inside a live attachment loop. They survive there. They break only when the loop dissolves quietly, without explanation, without emotional residue, without pursuit or protest. The paradox is this: the more your absence communicates something, the less it functions as rejection to an avoidant. True rejection to them is not loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't justify itself. It doesn't seek acknowledgement. It simply rearranges reality in a way that no longer includes them as a central figure. And until that happens, they won't feel loss. They'll feel powerful. Avoidants break when autonomy no longer protects them. The rejection that finally reaches an avoidant does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a conversation, a confrontation, or a carefully worded boundary speech. It doesn't explain what went wrong or ask for understanding. In fact, it often isn't even recognizable as rejection at first. It is quiet, unmarked, unexplained, and because of that, it bypasses every defense they've spent a lifetime perfecting. Avoidants are highly skilled at regulating themselves through distance, but only when that distance is chosen, controlled, and narratively coherent. What they cannot regulate is distance that no longer requires their participation. This rejection is not withdrawal as punishment. There is no edge to it, no emotional charge meant to provoke a response. It isn't silence designed to be noticed or absence intended to be felt. It is withdrawal as completion. The difference matters. Completion carries no agenda. It does not wait for an outcome. It does not measure success by reaction. It simply signals that something has finished running its course. And for an avoidant, that kind of ending is deeply destabilizing because it removes the illusion of autonomy as protection. You don't disappear when this happens. You don't cut them off or make yourself unreachable. You don't dramatize your exit or narrate your healing. You don't demand closure or offer a final emotional summary. You remain polite, regulated, even warm if contact occurs. But something fundamental has shifted. You are no longer orienting your nervous system around theirs. Your emotional state is no longer calibrated to their availability, their moods, or their capacity. You stop bracing for distance and stop managing closeness. You stop anticipating the push-pull. And in doing so, you exit the role they unconsciously assigned you. This is where the collapse begins. Avoidants rely on relational predictability to stay regulated. Not predictability of closeness, but predictability of control. They expect that if they pull back, you will either chase or protest. If they re-engage, you will soften and open again. That rhythm allows them to feel autonomous while still accessing connection on their terms. But when your nervous system stops responding in expected ways, the rhythm breaks. They pull back and nothing happens. They reappear and nothing shifts. The emotional levers they once used no longer move the system. What unsettles them is not your absence, but your neutrality, not your distance, but your lack of reactivity. They are used to people leaving in pain or staying in hope. They are not used to people simply finishing when there is no emotional residue left to metabolize, no anger, no longing, no bargaining. The avoidant is left alone with something unfamiliar, the realization that autonomy no longer guarantees safety. That distance no longer restores balance, that the strategy they relied on has stopped working. This is the rejection they cannot regulate because it doesn't invite regulation. There is nothing to respond to, nothing to reinterpret, nothing to manage. It doesn't ask to be processed. It just exists. And because avoidants externalize emotional regulation through relational control, when that control evaporates, they experience an internal destabilization. They can't immediately name. They don't feel rejected because you left. They feel rejected because you didn't need them them to leave. Avoidants are not threatened by endings in the way most people assume. They are threatened by irrelevance, by the loss of function, by the moment they realize they no longer occupy a necessary role in someone's emotional world. In most relationships, avoidants unconsciously position themselves as the gatekeepers of intimacy. They decide when closeness happens. They decide how much access is allowed. They decide when things cool down or intensify. They set the emotional thermostat and expect others to adjust accordingly. When you detach with resentment, that role remains intact. Your anger still reacts to their distance. Your boundaries still reference their behavior. Your healing still revolves around the impact they had. In those dynamics, the avoidant remains central. But when you detach without resentment, without emotional charge, you quietly remove them from that role. You no longer look to them for regulation, validation, or emotional pacing. And that removal is profoundly threatening because it strips them of influence without confrontation. They are no longer the regulator. Your emotional state does not rise and fall based on their availability. They are no longer the decider. You are not waiting for cues about when to get close or pull back. And they are no longer the emotional authority. Your sense of safety no longer requires their presence or approval. That shift is subtle on the surface, but internally it is seismic. Avoidants often confuse control with safety. As long as they can control proximity, they believe they are safe from engulfment, obligation, or emotional overwhelm. But when someone no longer needs them to initiate or withdraw, to create or relieve tension, that control loses its purpose. And with it goes the avoidance primary regulatory strategy. They are left facing the uncomfortable truth that the connection didn't end because they withdrew. It ended because it was no longer necessary for the other person's stability. This is why the rejection feels so different. It is not experienced as abandonment, which they know how to rationalize. It is experienced as displacement. You didn't storm out, you didn't collapse, you didn't demand change. You simply reorganized your internal world in a way that didn't include them as a central pillar. And because avoidants equate being needed with being safe, that reorganization registers as loss. What destabilizes them most is that they cannot locate fault or fix. There is no argument to replay, no boundary to negotiate, no emotional rupture to repair. There is only a quiet absence of influence, a sense that the dynamic they once managed has closed without their consent. And for someone whose attachment strategy is built on staying ahead of emotional consequence, that lack of agency is deeply unsettling. This is the moment avoidants begin to feel something. They often avoid naming the cost of emotional avoidance, not in the form of guilt or regret yet, but in the form of disorientation. The realization that distance didn't protect them from loss. It simply delayed awareness of it. That autonomy, when no longer mirrored by someone else's engagement, becomes isolation rather than freedom. And that is why this kind of rejection cuts so deeply. Not because it is harsh, but because it is clean. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is final. It doesn't argue with their defenses. It outgrows them. It lands when they realize you're no longer negotiating connection. The moment this rejection actually reaches an avoidant is rarely dramatic. There is no singular event, no obvious turning point they can point to and say, that's when it ended. Instead, it dawns slowly through a series of small, almost imperceptible realizations. Not when you block them, not when you announce you've moved on, not when you post evidence of your worth or your happiness. Those moments are easy for an avoidant to dismiss, reinterpret, or emotionally bypass. What reaches them is far quieter and far more destabilizing. It lands when your tone no longer carries expectation, when your words don't lean forward emotionally, hoping to be met, when your responses are present but not tethered, neutral, not cold, calm, not withdrawn. Avoidants are exquisitely sensitive to shifts in emotional negotiation. They can feel when someone is still bargaining internally, still adjusting themselves in hopes of preserving access. And they can also feel when that bargaining has stopped. Your boundaries don't wobble in this phase, not because you're rigid, but because you're no longer bracing for disappointment. You're not rehearsing what you'll say if they pull back. You're not over-explaining your needs to make them more palatable. You state what is true without waiting to see how it will be received. And that steadiness sends a signal the avoidance nervous system can't ignore. The connection is no longer up for renegotiation. Your presence no longer seeks permission. You're not asking, implicitly or explicitly, whether closeness is allowed. You're not scanning for signs of availability before being yourself. You don't modulate your warmth to avoid triggering withdrawal. You simply show up as you are, or you don't show up at all. And that binary is unfamiliar to someone accustomed to managing gray zones of proximity. What unsettles them most is that you're still still human, still warm. There is no bitterness in your voice, no edge in your silence. You haven't turned cold or punitive. You haven't hardened yourself into someone unrecognizable. The warmth remains, but it is no longer accessible through emotional shortcuts. They can't dip in and out. They can't reappear without accountability and expect the same access. The door isn't slammed, it's just no longer open on their terms. This is the point where absence becomes irreversible. Not because you've declared it so, but because the conditions that once allowed re-entry no longer exist. Avoidants often rely on the assumption that distance is temporary, that when they return, the emotional field will reset. But when they sense that your internal orientation has shifted, they realize something has closed, not out of anger, out of completion. And that realization lingers. It doesn't provoke immediate panic or pursuit. Instead, it creates a low-grade unease, a sense that something familiar is missing. Not the person, but the role they once played in regulating proximity. They begin to notice that your life continues without emotional reference to them, that your calm doesn't depend on their presence, that your availability is no longer negotiable. And slowly, the weight of that settles in. Because for the first time, they didn't choose distance. Distance chose them. Avoidants survive by leaving first, by numbing before attachment deepens, by controlling exit routes so that closeness never becomes a trap. These strategies are not conscious manipulations. They are learned survival responses. Distance has always been their way of staying safe. If they pull away before things get too intense, they avoid the vulnerability that once overwhelmed them. If they detach early, they don't have to feel the full impact of loss. But when you don't chase, don't collapse, and don't react, those strategies lose their effectiveness. There is nothing to push against, nothing to manage. The usual sequence withdrawal followed by pursuit doesn't play out. And in that absence of reaction, the avoidant encounters something unfamiliar, non-negotiable emotional consequence. This isn't abandonment. Abandonment implies suddenness, chaos, and emotional rupture. It isn't punishment either. There's no sense of being taught a lesson or coerced into change. What they feel instead is finality, a quiet, matter-of-fact realization that the connection has reached an endpoint that cannot be reversed through timing or distance. For an avoidant, this is deeply unsettling because it inverts their core belief about control. They are used to deciding when things end by pulling back, by disengaging, by making themselves unavailable. But here, distance arrives without their initiation. It is not something they chose. It is something they encounter. And that reversal forces them to confront a truth they've long avoided. Autonomy does not equal immunity from loss. They begin to understand, often subconsciously, that their absence was not the catalyst. Their presence was no longer required. The relationship didn't dissolve because they withdrew. It dissolved because the other person stopped organizing themselves around the avoidance capacity. And that distinction is painful in a way avoidants are not well equipped to process. This is why the experience feels like rejection to them, even though nothing overt has happened. There was no confrontation, no dramatic ending. Yet, the message is unmistakable. You are no longer central. And for someone whose attachment strategy depends on being able to re-enter relationships on their terms, that message cuts deeply. Finality is what avoidants fear most, not because it hurts in the moment, but because it offers no escape. There is nothing to delay, nothing to control, nothing to reinterpret. The emotional consequence has already occurred, and because it wasn't forced, argued, or demanded, it feels earned in a way that is difficult to dismiss. In this space, avoidance may begin to feel something they often postpone, the weight of what their distance costs. Not in a dramatic surge of regret, but in a quiet reckoning. The realization that leaving first doesn't always protect them, that numbing doesn't prevent loss, that controlling exit routes doesn't guarantee safety, and that sometimes the most profound rejection is not being pushed away, but being outgrown. They don't grieve you. They grieve the version of themselves that only existed with you. When avoidants finally feel the loss, it is rarely focused on the person and the way outsiders expect. They are not replaying conversations, longing for contact, or fantasizing about reunion in a conventional sense. What they begin to grieve is something far more subtle and unsettling, the internal state they accessed in your presence. With you, they felt calmer without being trapped. They experienced connection without consumption. They felt seen without being pressured to perform, explain, or merge. That combination is rare for someone whose nervous system associates closeness with threat. You functioned as a mirror they didn't know they were using. In your presence, their system downshifted. Not because you fixed them or asked less of them, but because you provided a relational environment that didn't demand self-betrayal. You didn't chase their withdrawal or punish their distance. You didn't collapse into anxiety or escalate emotional intensity to be chosen. And because of that, they were able to access a version of themselves that felt more regulated, more open, more human than usual. When that mirror disappears, they don't miss attention. Attention is easy to replace. Validation can be found elsewhere. What they miss is regulation they didn't know how to create alone. They miss the quiet steadiness that emerged around you without effort, the sense of being anchored without being bound, the feeling of existing in connection without the familiar undercurrent of danger. This is why the grief often arrives late. It doesn't surface during the breakup or the distancing phase when autonomy still feels intact. It surfaces later in moments of contrast when new connections feel either empty or overwhelming. When they notice how quickly their nervous system returns to hyper-independence or numbness, when they realize that the calm they once felt wasn't accidental, it was relational. Avoidants rarely articulate this grief out loud because it threatens their self-concept. To acknowledge that someone else facilitated regulation is to admit interdependence. And interdependence has historically felt unsafe. So instead of naming the loss, they feel it indirectly as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a vague sense that something meaningful slipped through their fingers. They may tell themselves they miss the ease, the dynamic, the timing. But underneath those rationalizations is a quieter truth. With you, they were closer to themselves, not the defended self, not the autonomous self, but the integrated one. And losing access to that version hurts in a way that is difficult to metabolize. This is why the regret, when it comes, is not romantic. It's existential. It's not about wanting the relationship back as much as wanting the internal state back. Wanting to feel regulated without armor, wanting to connected without fear, wanting to feel whole without having to manage distance. And when they realize that the state was not portable, that it was co-created, they experience a loss that can't be easily replaced. If it's a tactic, it won't work. This kind of rejection cannot be manufactured. Avoidants are acutely sensitive to incongruence. They can feel when detachment is strategic, when boundaries are performative, when silence is waiting to be broken. If your withdrawal is motivated by outcome, by the hope that they'll notice, miss, or return, it remains part of the same attachment dance, and they will feel that immediately. Avoidants don't respond to tactics, because tactics still imply engagement. They still imply that the relationship is active, that the emotional field is open for negotiation. Strategic detachment keeps the avoidant in the role of evaluator. Is this real? Will it last? Should I re-engage? That dynamic restores their sense of control and neutralizes the impact. The rejection that reaches them only happens when something internal has genuinely shifted. When you've returned to yourself, not as an act of self-improvement, but as a recalibration. When you've stopped outsourcing safety to the relationship. When your sense of stability no longer depends on proximity, reassurance, or resolution. And when you've accepted the cost of staying whole, even if it means losing connection. This acceptance is not dramatic. It doesn't come with declarations or closure speeches. It shows up as congruence. Your words match your energy. Your boundaries match your behavior. Your absence is not performative. It's simply where your life is now. And because there is no internal bargaining, there is no emotional leakage for the avoidant to detect. This is why the rejection cannot be rushed. It is not something you do to someone. It is something that happens as a byproduct of alignment. When you are no longer split, when you are not simultaneously leaving and hoping the relational dynamic resolves itself, and that resolution is felt by the avoidant even if nothing is said. If you try to imitate this state without inhabiting it, it collapses. The tone will be off, the timing will feel reactive, the energy will still lean forward. Avoidants are experts at sensing these subtleties because their survival depends on reading emotional undercurrents. They know when someone is still attached, even if the behavior looks detached. True rejection, to them, is not a posture, it's an absence of negotiation. It's the realization that there is no longer an emotional opening to return to. Not because you closed it deliberately, but because you outgrew the need to keep it open. And that realization only arrives when the alignment is real. This is why the outcome cannot be controlled. Sometimes the avoidant feels the loss and begins to reflect. Sometimes they double down on avoidance and move on. The point is not what they do next. The point is that the dynamic has ended cleanly, without residue, without entanglement, without self-erasure. And that is the quiet power of this rejection. It does not chase a reaction. It does not demand change. It simply honors truth. And for an avoidant who has spent a lifetime managing distance to feel safe, encountering someone who no longer needs that distance to survive is an experience that lingers long after the connection ends. They feel you most when you're no longer trying to be felt. This is the paradox most people never understand about avoidance. Pursuit does not create attachment for them. It creates pressure, and pressure activates the very defenses that keep them distant. The more someone tries to be seen, chosen, or understood by an avoidant, more the avoidance system interprets closeness as obligation. Attachment for them does not form in response to effort. It forms in response to safety, and safety is only possible when connection is not demanded. Avoidants attach through respectful distance. That does not collapse into resentment, not coldness, not withdrawal, as punishment, but a steady self-containment that doesn't require them to manage someone else's emotional state. When they sense that someone can remain grounded without constant reassurance, without escalating emotion, without chasing proximity, something in their nervous system relaxes. They feel room to approach rather than pressure to perform. But here's where the paradox sharpens. The moment you stop trying to be felt, you actually become feelable. When you're no longer asking, am I enough? You stop broadcasting insecurity into the relational field. You stop leaning forward emotionally, waiting for confirmation. And in that absence of demand, the avoidant finally has space to notice what is missing. When you stop asking whether you matter, the question shifts. It moves out of your mouth and into their internal world. Why wasn't I? Why wasn't my presence enough to keep them oriented here? Why didn't my distance pull them back? Why didn't my reappearance restore the dynamic? These questions don't arise when you chase. They arise when your stability no longer depends on the answer. Avoidants are accustomed to being the ones who are pursued, adjusted to, waited on. That dynamic allows them to remain emotionally insulated. But when you remove yourself from that position, not by force, but by resolution, you ink the relational gravity. Suddenly, they are the ones sensing absence without leverage. They are the ones confronting a lack they didn't orchestrate. This is not because you became distant or unavailable in a performative way. It's because you became internally settled. You no longer required their responsiveness to feel secure. And that security is what makes your absence felt, not as abandonment, but as a quiet recalibration of reality. The paradox is that avoidants don't miss intensity. They miss steadiness. They don't miss being wanted. They miss being unnecessary to someone who was once emotionally open. And when they realize that your wholeness doesn't require their participation, it challenges a core assumption they've relied on, that distance is power. The rejection that breaks an avoidant is the one that doesn't need to be explained. The rejection that reaches an avoidant does not come with a speech. It does not require justification, processing, or mutual understanding. It doesn't arrive wrapped in anger or grief. It simply exists as a fact. You didn't punish them. You didn't disappear. You didn't chase protest or perform healing in hopes of being seen. You didn't turn your growth into a message. You simply became unavailable to anything that required self-erasure. That is the line avoidants feel most clearly because it doesn't accuse them. It doesn't demand change. It doesn't frame them as wrong or broken. It just reflects reality. The dynamic could only continue if someone kept shrinking, and you chose not to be that person anymore. This kind of rejection doesn't activate defensiveness. There is nothing to argue with, no behavior to reinterpret, no emotional spike to wait out. It doesn't collapse into resolution or reconciliation. It closes the loop quietly. And because it doesn't seek acknowledgement, it cannot be undone through charm, timing, or distance. Avoidants are skilled at surviving conflict. They are less skilled at surviving clarity. When something ends without chaos, without blame, without emotional residue, they are left alone with the truth of it. And that truth is simple. The connection ended because it could not exist without cost to the other person's integrity. That realization is not explosive. It is heavy. It settles slowly, often long after the relationship has technically ended, in moments of stillness. In contrast with other connections, in the awareness that something genuine was lost, not because of incompatibility, but because avoidance has limits. And that is why this rejection is irreversible. Not because doors were slammed, but because the internal architecture changed. You are no longer organized around their capacity. Your sense of self is no longer contingent on their availability. And once that shift occurs, there is nothing to return to. You didn't break them by leaving. You didn't break them by staying. You didn't break them at all. You simply stopped breaking yourself. And for an avoidant, encountering someone who chose wholeness over proximity is an experience that doesn't fade, not because it demands to be remembered, but because it doesn't need to be.